There's a barn floor in Holmes County, Ohio that stays 40 degrees in July. No electricity, no refrigeration, no compressor humming in the corner. I pressed my hand against the dirt the first time I walked into that space, and it felt like touching stone pulled from deep water. Cold. Not cool, cold. The family that built it 4 generations ago used a material their grandfather could gather in an afternoon from the creek that ran through the back 40. He never bought a bag of anything, never ordered from a catalog, never asked permission from anyone. That floor has kept potatoes, carrots, apples, and dairy cool for over 100 years, and the only thing it's ever needed is what the land already had to give. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly how to replicate what that grandfather built using a material you can find within a mile of your house, and you'll know why the modern refrigeration industry spent decades making sure this knowledge stayed buried in old barns instead of printed in building manuals. The first time I noticed something different about an Amish root cellar was not in winter, when you'd expect the cool, but in the middle of August. I'd been visiting a family near Walnut Creek for about a year at that point, helping with some timber work, and one afternoon, the eldest son, a man named Isaac, asked if I wanted to see where they kept the milk. I expected a spring house, maybe a cellar with stone walls. What I found was a rectangular room dug into the hillside, maybe 12 feet by 16, with a ceiling just tall enough to stand in without hitting your head. The air inside hit me the way air does when you step into a limestone cave in summer. Heavy, damp, still, and shockingly cold. Isaac walked me to the back corner and pointed down. The floor wasn't concrete, it wasn't tamped clay. It was covered in smooth, rounded stones, the kind you'd see in a creek bed after a heavy rain, each one about the size of a lemon or a small apple. They were damp, almost wet, but there was no standing water. The surface looked dry enough to walk on, but when I crouched down and touched the gravel, my fingers came back cold and slightly moist. I asked him what it was for, and he said something I didn't fully understand at the time. He said the floor breathes. I nodded, but I didn't yet know what he meant by that. It took more visits. More looking, before I began to see that this wasn't just gravel dumped on the ground to keep boots out of the mud. This was a system, a carefully layered structure designed to hold moisture, release it slowly, and keep the temperature locked in a range that modern engineers would call precision climate control. The Amish didn't use those words. They just said it kept the milk from spoiling and the potatoes from sprouting, and that was enough. What I eventually learned, and what took me weeks of digging through old USDA manuals, homesteading journals, and long conversations with builders who still work the old way, is that rounded creek gravel is one of the most thermally stable materials you can put under a root cellar floor. It's not decorative. It's not traditional in the sense of something people did because their fathers did it. It's functional in a way that only makes sense once you understand what soil, water, and air do when they're arranged correctly below ground. Here's the principle that makes this work, and once you see it, you'll understand why every traditional root cellar from Pennsylvania to Korea used some version of the same idea. At 6 feet below the surface, the ground temperature locks in and stays constant all year. In Ohio, that's about 54 degrees. In Pennsylvania, 52. The soil at that depth doesn't care what's happening above. It doesn't warm up in July. It doesn't freeze in January. It just sits there, holding the same temperature month after month, year after year, like a battery that never drains. The challenge is getting that stable temperature into the space where you're storing food. If you dig a hole and leave the floor as bare dirt, you'll get some cooling, but you'll also get mud when moisture condenses, and you'll lose the thermal stability because dirt compacts, holds water unevenly, and creates pockets of warmth where air can't move. If you pour concrete, you've created a barrier that blocks the ground's natural moisture exchange, and the air inside the cellar dries out too much. Food shrivels, potatoes turn hard, apples lose their crispness. Creek gravel solves both problems at once. The stones are rounded because they have been tumbled by moving water for thousands of years, and that smooth shape creates large gaps between each piece. Those gaps allow air to circulate underneath the floor, which means the cool, stable temperature from the soil below can rise into the cellar space without restriction. At the same time, moisture from the ground can wick up through the gravel, evaporate slowly into the air, and keep the humidity right where root vegetables need it, somewhere between 75 and 90%. Not too dry, not too wet, just balanced. The Amish didn't read a textbook to figure this out. They observed. They noticed that cellars with clay floors stayed too damp and grew mold. They noticed that cellars with sand floors dried out too fast and cracked the vegetables. They noticed that when they used smooth stones from the creek, the kind that had no sharp edges and no dust, the floor stayed cold, slightly moist and clean. That knowledge got passed down, father to son, builder to apprentice, for generations. By the time I saw it in Isaac's cellar, it had been refined to a point where every detail mattered. The size of the stones, the depth of the layer, even which part of the creek they were gathered from. Now, before I show you exactly how to build this, I need to tell you about a document I found that traces this same principle back further than I expected. The USDA published an agricultural survey in 1903 that documented Amish and Mennonite settlements across eastern Ohio and Pennsylvania. The report was dry, technical, written for government researchers, but buried in the middle of it was a section on food storage structures. The surveyors noted that nearly every Amish farmstead they visited had a root cellar with what they called a gravel floor bed, and they measured the temperature stability across multiple seasons. The data showed that cellars with 4 to 6 inches of rounded creek gravel maintained temperatures within a 2-degree range year-round, while cellars with dirt or stone slab floors fluctuated by as much as 10 to 15 degrees, depending on rainfall and seasonal changes. That report is over 120 years old. The technique it describes is still being used in Holmes County today in the exact same way, with the exact same materials. But here's the part that should make you pause. If this method worked so well that government researchers documented it in 1903, and if it's still working in 2025, why don't modern building guides mention it? Why don't root cellar plans sold online include gravel floors as an option? Why don't homesteading books explain which kind of gravel to use and where to place it? The answer is the same answer that explains why most forgotten household systems disappeared. The moment refrigeration became a product you could buy, the house itself stopped being expected to do the work. In the 1920s, General Electric and Frigidaire launched the first mass-market home refrigerators. They were expensive, unreliable, and used toxic gases as coolant, but they had one advantage that changed everything. They could be sold, serviced, and replaced. A root cellar couldn't. A root cellar was built once, required no maintenance, consumed no electricity, and lasted as long as the house stood. There was no subscription, no repair contract, no replacement cycle. It was thermally independent, and that made it economically invisible. By the 1950s, refrigeration had become standard in American homes. And architects stopped designing houses with root cellars entirely. The building codes shifted to require mechanical cooling for food storage, and passive systems like gravel floors, underground chambers, and natural ventilation were quietly removed from architectural education. It wasn't banned, it was just replaced, and the replacement came with a monthly bill. But the physics didn't change. The ground is still 54 degrees at 6 feet down. Creek gravel still creates airflow and moisture balance, and the Amish families who never switched to electric refrigeration are still using the same floors their great-grandfathers built, because those floors still work exactly the way they were designed to. Now, here's what a modern version of this looks like for someone who already owns a house and doesn't want to dig a full underground cellar. You don't need to excavate a hillside. You don't need stone walls. You don't need to replicate a 19th century structure. What you need is access to the stable ground temperature, a way to manage moisture, and a small insulated space that keeps outside heat from interfering. That can be built in a weekend with materials you can gather yourself or buy for under $200. Here's the simplest version. You dig a trench or a small pit in your yard, about 6 feet deep and 6 feet square. The size doesn't matter as much as the depth, because you're trying to reach that stable 54-degree zone. Once you hit 6 feet, you stop digging downward and start widening the floor. You want a flat base, smooth and level, where water won't pool in any one spot. Then, you bring in the gravel. The type of gravel matters more than most people realize. You're not looking for crushed stone from a quarry, the kind with sharp edges and flat sides. That material compacts too tightly and blocks airflow. You're looking for rounded creek gravel, sometimes called river rock or creek bedstone, the kind that's been shaped by moving water until every surface is smooth. The size should be between 3/4 of an inch and 1.5 inches in diameter. Smaller than that, and the stones packed together too densely. Larger than that, and the gaps become so big that moisture doesn't wick evenly. You spread that gravel across the entire floor of your cellar space in a layer 4 to 6 inches deep. No need to go thicker. Because you're not building a driveway, you're building a thermal interface between the cold ground below and the air above. Once the gravel's in place, you can leave it as the finished floor, or you can lay a thin layer of sand on top and then place flat stones or bricks if you want a more solid walking surface. Either way, the gravel underneath is doing the real work, pulling coolness from the earth, releasing moisture into the air, and keeping the temperature stable. The walls can be simple. If you're digging into a hillside, the soil itself is the wall, and you just need to line it with stone or treated lumber to keep it from collapsing. If you're building a freestanding structure, you can use concrete blocks, stacked stone, or even thick timber posts with earth packed around them. The key is insulation on the ceiling and the door. It's because heat enters from above, not from the sides. A roof insulated with at least 6 inches of foam board or straw bales and a thick wooden door with weather stripping will keep the summer heat from dropping into your cellar and ruining the effect. Now, here's the part where I need to be honest with you, because I respect your intelligence too much to exaggerate this. The amount of cooling you get depends on where you live. If you're in a region where the ground temperature at 6 feet is 52 to 58 degrees, like most of the northern United States, this system works beautifully. You'll maintain a root cellar between 40 and 55 degrees year-round with no electricity, no mechanical cooling, and no maintenance beyond sweeping the floor once a season. If you're in the deep south, where ground temperatures at 6 feet can reach 65 to 70 degrees, you'll still get cooling, but the range will be higher, somewhere between 55 and 65 degrees. That's still functional for storing root vegetables, apples, canned goods, and even dairy for short periods. But it won't match the performance of a northern cellar. The physics is the same, but the starting temperature is different, and there's no way around that without digging deeper or adding mechanical assistance. The best climates for this system are places with cold winters and moderate summers: Ohio, Pennsylvania, Indiana, Wisconsin, upstate New York, Michigan, parts of the Midwest, and the northern plains. If you live in those regions and you've been paying for a second refrigerator in the garage just to store extra produce, or if you've been buying cold storage units that run on electricity and break down every few years, this is a fundamentally different option. You build it once, and it works for as long as the structure stands. Now I want to tell you about a mistake I see people make when they try to build root cellars based on online guides or modern homesteading advice. They focus on the walls, the door, the insulation, the ventilation pipes, all of which matter, but they treat the floor as an afterthought. They pour concrete because it's clean and easy to sweep, or they leave bare dirt because they think it doesn't matter. Then they wonder why the cellar's too dry in winter, too damp in summer, or why the temperature swings more than they expected. The floor is not an afterthought. The floor is the thermal foundation of the entire system. It's the interface between the stable, cool ground and the air you're trying to control. If you get the floor wrong, nothing else works right. The Amish understood this because they built with observation, not with blueprints. They noticed that smooth creek gravel created the right balance, and they kept using it because it kept working. That's how real knowledge accumulates, not through theory, but through generations of testing what the land gives you and seeing what lasts. Here's the detail I promised you at the beginning, the one I found buried in the research and have never seen published in any modern guide. The Amish families in Lancaster County and Holmes County don't just use creek gravel on the floor, they use it around the perimeter of the cellar walls as well, packed into the gap between the stone or timber wall and the surrounding earth. That gravel layer, usually 6 to 12 inches thick, acts as a drainage zone that pulls moisture away from the wall surface and prevents the kind of damp rot that destroys wooden structures and creates mold on stone. But it does something else that took me a long time to understand. It creates a secondary thermal buffer. The gravel around the walls absorbs coolness from the surrounding soil, and radiates it inward, which means the cellar isn't just being cooled from below, it's being cooled from all sides. The effect is subtle, maybe 2 to 4 degrees of additional stability, but over the course of a summer, that difference is the line between food that keeps and food that spoils. I saw this firsthand in a cellar near Millersburg that had been in continuous use since 1887. The builder had lined the walls with dry stacked stone, and behind that stone was a 12-inch layer of rounded creek gravel that ran from the floor all the way to the ceiling line. The current owner, a man in his 70s whose grandfather had helped build it, told me that in the worst heat of August, the cellar never climbed above 48 degrees. I checked the thermometer myself. He wasn't exaggerating. That system had been passively regulating temperature for over 130 years with nothing but stone, gravel, and the stable ground beneath it. The knowledge that built that cellar was never written down in a manual. It was learned by watching what worked, testing small changes, and keeping what proved itself. The rounded stones weren't chosen because someone read a study. They were chosen because sharp-edged gravel didn't work as well, and smooth gravel did. That's empirical knowledge, the kind that survives because it's repeatable, not because it's marketed. Now, if you're thinking about building this yourself, here's what you need to know about sourcing the gravel. The best option is to gather it yourself from a local creek or riverbed, assuming you have legal access to the land. You're looking for stones that have been naturally rounded by water, not crushed or processed. The color doesn't matter. The mineral composition doesn't matter. What matters is the shape and the size, smooth, rounded, 3/4 of an inch to 1.5 inches. If you can hold a handful and see gaps between every stone, that's the right material. If you don't have access to a creek, you can buy river rock or creek gravel from a landscape supply company. It's sold by the cubic yard, and for a 6x6-foot cellar with a 4-inch gravel layer, you'll need about half a cubic yard. That costs between $30 and $60 depending on where you live. Compare that to the cost of a chest freezer, which runs between $300 and $700 and consumes electricity every day for the rest of its life. And you start to see why this method was abandoned. It wasn't less effective, it was less profitable. Here's what I want you to understand before we finish. This is not a primitive technique that got replaced by something better. This is a proven thermal system that got replaced by something you can sell. The difference matters, because one of those statements implies progress, and the other implies a transfer of cost. The Amish root cellar works on the same principle today that it worked on in 1887. The ground is still 54 degrees at 6 feet. The gravel still creates airflow and moisture balance. The walls still insulate. The door still seals. Nothing has changed except that most people were taught to buy refrigeration instead of building thermal independence. The average American household spends between $800 and $1,200 a year on electricity, and a significant portion of that goes to running refrigerators and freezers. Over 30 years, that's $24,000 to $36,000 spent on a system that requires constant power, breaks down every 10 to 15 years, and stops working entirely the moment the grid fails. A root cellar costs a few $100s to build, works for generations, and operates on nothing but the physics of the earth beneath your feet. That's not an opinion. That's a comparison of two systems, one that requires payment forever and one that requires construction once. The Amish chose the second option because they understood that the best machine is the one you never have to buy. The modern world chose the first option because someone figured out how to make it profitable. If you've ever opened your electric bill in the summer and felt like you were paying a tax just to keep food from spoiling, you now know there was always another way. It's still here. It still works. It just stopped being taught the moment refrigeration became something you could buy in a store. Here's what I want to know. If you built a root cellar using this method, where would you put it? In your backyard, under a hillside, near a creek, in a corner of your property that stays shaded? Drop that in the comments and tell me your state, because the ground temperature changes depending on where you live, and I want to hear what's realistic for your climate. If your grandparents or great-grandparents had a root cellar or a spring house, I want to hear about that too, because that knowledge is part of the same tradition that the Amish preserved, and every story like that is one more reminder that this wasn't unusual 100 years ago. It was normal. And if you're the kind of person who believes that practical knowledge has been quietly sidelined to make room for products you have to keep paying for, you already know what comes next. Subscribe because the next video goes deeper.